The trailer for Emerald Fennel's adaptation of Wuthering Heights came out nearly 2 months ago, because I am nothing if not prompt, and the internet went wild. Not in a good way. Partly it's because Emerald Fennel herself is a polarising character, beloved for promising young women and slated for Saltburn. And partly it was because of the nature of the trailer itself. Margot Robbie is too old for Catty, Jacob Elordi is too white for Heathcliff, and what on earth is going on with that fish? The trailer showed a film that was explicitly sexual in nature and disgusting in aesthetic, and people were not happy. I myself am not some sort of Emerald Fennel apologist. She seems to me to be an author who is more concerned with style than substance, who can only make her points in the most heavy-handed way possible, and who has a real lack of understanding of class dynamics. She's like the film world's R.F. Kuang. But I am interested in why this trailer garnered such a strong reaction and what it says about our current cultural zeitgeist. So in this video, I will be looking at cultural prudishness alongside a rise in right-wing politics, what it means for an adaptation to be faithful and whether this is something that adaptations should even be striving towards, and ragebait as a marketing gimmick. So let's start there. In doing my research for this video, many of the articles commenting on the backlash to the release of Emerald Fennel's trailer talked about how perhaps this response was actually part of the plan. Donald Clark's article in the Irish Times was titled, "The outrage over Emerald Fennel's Wuthering Heights is boiling over. She must be delighted." And this is because of the rise in so-called ragebait marketing. I'm not sure how new this actually is because, to be honest, I didn't look it up, but I did read several articles about it being particularly prevalent at the moment. If you've never heard the term, ragebait marketing is when a brand, person, etc. does something outrageous and controversial, sometimes by accident, but usually intentionally, with the goal of going viral and inspiring more comments and shares and think pieces and millions of dollars of free marketing, like what I'm doing right now. Researchers call this the confrontation effect, where people are more likely to engage with content that challenges their views than with content that aligns with them. The amount of people that I saw after this trailer was first released sharing said trailer with comments about how this isn't Wuthering Heights. Because outrage and indignation are harder to stifle, people feel compelled to share their own feelings about the topic, increasing the salience of the topic. I hardly ever hear about people talking about trailers they aren't mad about. And I think this makes sense when we're talking about Emerald Fennel's adaptation of Wuthering Heights for 2 major reasons. As I mentioned earlier, while Saltburn was a big hit for Amazon Prime in 2023, becoming one of the platform's top 10 debuts of the year despite only being released in December, reviews and reactions were much more polarised. Some claimed it was incisive and visually stunning, praising the outrageous, laugh-out-loud punchlines. Others, such as Sophie Monks-Kaufman, found that the story's superficial treatment of its characters becomes increasingly ruinous, and that the most menacing thing anyone can muster here is a passive-aggressive karaoke choice, i.e. more style than substance. There was already an edge to how people respond to Emerald Fennel's work, and so perhaps the marketing department decided to lean into that. This, combined with the fact that it is an adaptation of a beloved piece of English literature, a subgenre already fraught with the expectations of millions of people with their own reading of the original text, just waiting for you to do wrong so that they can castigate you, means that the outrage was already baked in. A polarising creator known from the outrageous combines with a genre where any slip from faithfulness and people want your guts for garter. If rage was an inevitable reception, why not lean into it? There would be nowhere near as much publicity, no Taylor Swift-style fan theories, for an author with a more straightforward trailer edit. Because, to be clear, no audience has seen the final film yet. I would not make, and you would not watch, a video about a boring trailer, would we? It makes sense to me that someone like Fennell, known for being controversial, who is adapting a book that is also controversial, would make controversy part of the push. Last year, filmmakers Drew Goddard and Robert Eggers said of the makers of Saltburn that they were doing truly dangerous work. Classic Hollywood hyperbole, but we can see the vibe that we're going for here. And as I said, the work being adapted is Wuthering Heights. This isn't the gentle satire of Jane Austen or the caricatures of Charles Dickens. This is Emily Bronte we're working with. In 1847, when the novel was first published under the pseudonym Ellis Bell, it was deemed by Victorians to be savage, indecent, and immoral. One critic called it a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors. Charlotte Bronte edited it in 1850 after Emily's death and apologised for the behaviour of Heathcliff in her preface, and she also attempted to do damage control for her sister, whom some of the public had deemed to be disturbed. In the 19th century, this book did not have the same reputation reputation that it has today. Literary historians considered it to be a curiosity at best and a lurid tale of passion at worst. As I discussed in an earlier video on this same novel, Bronte is using earlier genres of the Romantic and the Gothic, both of which were out of favour by the time the novel was published. George Saintsbury in the English novel says, "The novel still ranked low. It was too apt to grovel and maunder in sentiment or to shriek and gibber in extravagances. I consider this especially interesting when I consider the fan theories that have sprung up about Emerald Fennel's adaptation. The likeness some have noticed to the bodice-ripping romance novels of pre-2020, but mostly the 80s and 90s. These also ranked low and maunder in sentiment or else shriek in extravagances. But all of this is supposition. We haven't seen the film. What I am saying is that Wuthering Heights is no stranger to controversy. Francis O'Gorman, Professor of Victorian Literature at Leeds University, said Wuthering Heights was considered to be a rough and vulgar novel when it was published. It was full of swearing, such as phrases like "what the devil" and "damnable jade." This was quite shocking language at the time. It is exactly the kind of book that is ripe for shock marketing, and something more than "what the devil" would be needed to capture that original shock for a modern audience. But why did this ragebait tactic, if indeed it was intentional, work so well? I think there are two main possibilities. One of these is the idea that in order for an adaptation to be successful, it must be faithful to the original text it is adapting. And the other is the idea that sex no longer sells. Our culture is becoming more puritanical and prudish, and anything explicit automatically invokes rage. Let's see how right those assumptions are. When I first started thinking about why this trailer evoked such a strong reaction, I had several ideas. Emerald Fennel's existing divisiveness, meaning that people have a bitch-eating crackers relationship with her, I have already mentioned. And the second reason being the perils of adaptation, which we will come to later. But the other idea is that people seem to have become more puritanical of late, especially Gen Z. And so they responded strongly to a trailer that was explicitly, perhaps even deviantly, sexual. But where did I get this idea? It kind of seemed I had gained it by osmosis. Gen Z are prudes, the women are abstaining from sex and hate porn, the men are addicted to porn and hate themselves for it, and also are abstaining from masturbation, potentially. It wasn't an idea that I'd come to from any concrete direction, so I couldn't tell you why I thought it. And as Sarah Marshall says, what do you not need evidence to believe? This story made some sense to me, so I just believed it. There have been many think pieces about how Gen Z aren't having as much casual sex as previous generations. Considering that the youngest Gen Z are 12, I certainly hope they aren't having any sex. I don't think we can make sweeping generalizations about the sex lives of this generation. And I know generations are mostly marketing, and while there is some relevance to the cohort effect, much of this can only be seen retroactively. Comparing the sex lives of 27-year-olds and 12-year-olds and the opinions of said people about sex, it isn't going to be very clear. In my research, I discovered this idea of the puriteen, online teenagers who chastise or cancel people for expressing sexuality. The earliest example was a DM to a Twitter user where someone who is 15 tried someone for liking some really questionable stuff, including horny Hannibal tweets. The original poster says, "Just saw someone use the term puriteens," and wow, is that an apt description. But one person on an app that only approximately 30% of Generation Z actually use is hardly concrete data, and is perhaps more evidence of a kids these days kind of an attitude. The loudest people in these arenas get all of the attention, much like I said about Ragebait. Anything that is the far end of an extreme is picked up and magnified for clicks. And while a study from UCLA called Teens and Screens did find 44.3% of teens think romance in media is overused, and 47.5% said they felt that sex isn't needed for the plot of most TV shows and movies. That's not the same as them saying they want all sex to be removed from films and television, or that they are prudish about the types of sexual content shown. In fact, when I was a teen myself, millennials were chided for being more puritanical than those that had come before them because they weren't drinking as much, though they have now in some arenas caught up, and this may have been due more to a lack of disposable income than anything to do with moralistic ideas about alcohol. And while there is a myth of the hippie love child boomer, more than half of 18 to 30-year-olds in 1972 voted for Richard Nixon, and 42% of 18 to 34-year-olds voted for Thatcher in 1979. There has always been a range of conservative, liberal and leftist ideas among young people. We just hear the loudest voices. The reason why I believe that this idea of the backlash had something to do with prudishness was because I connect the idea of prudishness to the right wing. Because I also connect the right wing with religiousness, attempts to control women, discrimination and prejudice against LGBTQ+ people. And all of these things are linked to prudishness. And all of this matters because there appears to have been a shift rightwards, both politically and culturally, in the UK and the US in recent years. 17% of young people in the UK say that they will vote for reform, almost double the number of those who said they would vote for UKIP 10 years ago. However, this rise is reflected in a rise amongst all age groups, and is not exceptional among the young. And most of the rise in this right-wing vote for reform, it comes from young men, not from young people generally. The most important thing is how this is reflected culturally. What is interesting to me is that people broadly on the left and the right both seem to think that prudishness comes from the other side. As I said, for those who think that it is on the right, the link between prudishness, religiousness, control of women and anti-LGBT sentiments all seem to clearly be pointing towards right-wing prudishness. Indeed, one of the talking points about Gen Z being Puritans is the online discussion about kink at Pride. But much of this actually seems to be a right-wing astroturf campaign. Just because someone says they're a blue-haired teen doesn't mean they actually are. Those who think that prudishness starts on the left, it is the sister to virtue signalling and cancel culture, a certain sanctimonious that the online right perceive in the liberals, and it is mostly liberals and not leftists, with whom they interact online. But when examples are cited, which they are often not, and it is more a vibes-based idea, they are usually anecdotes of non-influential people online who have taken something too far. The culture wars that make up much of our media idea of left versus right seem to be mostly the media blowing things out of all proportion. Take, for example, the Sydney Sweeney American Eagle campaign, where it talked about her having good genes. There were a few people on the left who suggested that this sounded eugenicist, and that got picked up by the likes of Ben Shapiro, who blasted it on his television show that millions of people watched, using the examples of people on Twitter who had fewer than 500 followers. But bringing it back to the trailer I am supposed to be discussing, I do think that this has some salience. The Instagram, TikTok, Twitter reactions to the trailer that were in horror of it were then blown up out of all proportion by a media that loves a kids these days, liberals these days take, which is exactly the ragebait culture war it may have been leaning into in the marketing. But while the articles did mention a certain squeamishness in relation to the sexual nature of the trailer, I am not sure that that was the major reason for the reaction. At least only tangentially. Also, this is not the first time Wuthering Heights has received a shock update. In 2012, the BBC produced a radio play in which they attempt to evoke the shock factor of the original publication by liberal use of the word fuck. And people hated it then too. I think 2012 was less of a culture war-y time, and definitely considering that many of Gen Z would have been literal infants at the time, and that the audience of BBC Radio 3 tends to skew older, we can't take a kids these days reaction. So our new age being sex negative doesn't seem to make sense for the reason that there was a strong negative reaction to this trailer. Even in this new age, there is a subgenre of fiction that is very popular in the online, supposedly sex negative space. Weird girl lit. These books feature unsettling body horror, uncomfortable sex scenes, use of food in incredibly unappetizing ways, themes of obsession, ownership, consumption, and violence. Sound familiar? This trailer seems to be pointing towards the idea that this is a weird girl lit adaptation of Wuthering Heights, a book by one of the original Weird Girls. So while the trailer may have been destined to spark outrage, the adaptation isn't entirely outside of the zeitgeist, at least of a small portion of the online bookish world. No, I think the reason that people reacted badly to this trailer is the reason that they react badly to all adaptations. Faithfulness. The backlash I saw to this trailer did say things like, this is gross and everything is sexualized these days. But mostly people were saying, this is not Wuthering Heights. Which of course it is, and also isn't. People were saying Kathy isn't blonde and she's not middle-aged, which I don't think it's fair to call Margot Robbie exactly middle-aged, but no, she's not a teenager. But who really cares that much about her hair colour? Or this isn't Regency clothing and Wuthering Heights is set in the Regency era. Adaptations can change the era of the original text. We haven't seen the film. We don't know when it's set. Heathcliff isn't meant to be white. He is black or Romany. This one I can see more nuanced arguments for. There were some people who were claiming this for the reasons of authenticity only. And if that's all you care about, technically speaking, Nellie Dean isn't Asian in the books either. And also some of the descriptions of Heathcliff's dark skin in the books link this to his supposedly evil character. When he's first introduced to us, his dark skin and his evil look are directly compared. So his blackness being tied to his character, not necessarily a good thing. to bring into the modern world. Like I said, this one has more arguments than just authenticity, but authenticity is not a reason that stands up on its own. And of all the commenters saying this isn't Wuthering Heights, I think most of that was based on vibe alone. People complained over the music being by Charlie XCX and the supposed jumping on the bandwagon of summer last year. Period films combined with modern pop music is not exactly something new. People love Marie Antoinette by Sofia Coppola and Django Unchained by Tarantino and Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. And aside from that, I've also talked about how controversy, indecency, and immorality are all a part of the original text. In fact, in some readings, people have seen hints that perhaps Heathcliff is Cathy's father's illegitimate son, making any romance between them incest. And that's much grosser than fingering a fish. But why do we need adaptations to be faithful in order to consider them good? There is always, when an adaptation of a book comes out, people who come to the film for faithfulness to the original, and those that are ranked highly in faithfulness receive the seal of approval. But I feel like this is kind of a bad take. Adaptation is much like translation. It is impossible for them to be truly faithful because there isn't a one-for-one between languages or between mediums. All of them involve making choices, whether over small things like what Wuthering Heights will actually look like. I'm gonna have to let this cat in because she won't stop shouting. To large choices that pull inspiration from the original but are, as all art is, of the moment in which they are created, reacting to and commenting on the world in which they are produced, using the parallels and gaps and frictions that they find in the source material. This talk of faithfulness, straying from the original, lack of fidelity, it's also puritanical and moralizing. We may not be that prudish a society in terms of sex, but we seemingly are in terms of artistic exploration. I mean, even a film is technically speaking an adaptation of a screenplay. Actors are translating into performance a written script and making choices as they do so. The only truly faithful copy would be to reprint the original novel. Short of that, any adaptation is going to be unfaithful in one way or another. Even a reprint of the novel would be received differently due to the different political context between the first print and now, and our knowledge of the existence of the first run. So even that wouldn't be completely faithful. In his work, 12 Fallacies of Adaptation Theory, Thomas Leach says, the near fixation with the issue of fidelity has inhibited and blurred adaptation studies since its inception. Fidelity to its source text, whether in recreating specific detail or the effect of the whole, is a hopelessly fallacious measure of a given adaptation's value, because it is unattainable, undesirable, and theoretically possible only in a trivial sense. The source text will always be better at being itself. Even if adaptations are remakes in the same medium, their most conscious attempts to replicate original will betray their differences, and thus their inferiority, which amounts to betrayal. He argues that adaptation studies needs to move away from fidelity as a marker of a text. And by text, I mean any piece being studied, not just written work. And since this work was published in 2003, most academics in the field seem to have done just that. Writing in 2008, Simone Murray described fidelity as an inadequate schema for appreciating the richness of and motivations driving adaptations. If we take Wuthering Heights as our example, it is a book that has many people arguing over what it means as a novel anyway. Is it the greatest love story of all time? Is it just horrible people being horrible over and over again? Is it an exploration of repressed lesbian sexuality and Emily Bronte's feeling that she should really have been a man? How could one person faithfully adapt a book that no one agrees on in the first place? Bluestone says, the filmmaker merely treats the novel as raw material and ultimately creates his own structure, with the novel firmly put in its place as less a norm than a point of departure. If Emerald Fennel is merely using Wuthering Heights as a jumping off point, an intertext with which she is engaging, what does it matter if it is the Wuthering Heights you read or not? I think this is linked to the idea that I talked about in my video on reading and empathy, linked in the cards. The idea that books are better and therefore a morally superior form of storytelling. A common phrase in the bookish world is the book was better. And whilst you can certainly say that you enjoyed the book more, or that the book was more successful as a story than the film was as a film, I do think there is a sense of superiority in such a phrase. An idea that not only it was the book better, but that you are a better person for liking the book more, or for having read the book at all. And I think getting judgy and snobby about hobbies is just a bit weird. As I have said in a previous video, the old and entrenched forms of media always view new rivals with suspicion and hostility, especially when money is at play. Just as people derided novels 2 centuries ago as inferior to plays and poetry, and less morally good too, filling young girls' heads with stuff and nonsense, so too do people with film adaptations today. Each form first gains popularity, and then as time goes on, respectability. Jazz was once inferior and unintelligent, and now is a prestige genre, though of course racism has a lot to do with that. Film has moved towards respectability, having now entered its second century, but still there are those who say the book is better. The book is different, certainly, different in experience and in its functionality, but different and better are not synonyms. I think another part of the belief in the inferiority of films is the obviousness of its production by a large team and of its commercialism. Even those films that are seen as quality films, their production as a group effort is hidden behind the idea of the auteur director. We are used as a culture to seeing genius as an individual pursuit, and so it is easier to imagine the lonely and half-mad writer passionately producing an individual work of genius than a huge production company making a genius film. But as Murray says, the book is demonstrably as much the product of institutions, agents, and material forces as is the Hollywood blockbuster. Yet adaptation theorists regularly emphasize the power of Hollywood's political economy, as though books were quasi-virginal texts, untouched by the commercial concerns prior to their screen adaptation. Book history has demonstrated the commercial subcultures of book culture have existed since at least the Gutenberg Revolution. Books are as much productions by groups as films are, as much at the whims of the market. So we should not think of them as inherently superior, and we only do this in a general way anyway. Which is more intellectual, Oppenheimer or It Ends With Us? If we can differentiate in a matchup like this, perhaps the blanket "the book is better" should be left in the past as well. Why should we make an adaptation if it doesn't matter if it's faithful to the original text? Firstly, an adaptation should stand on its own. Not everyone in the audience will be familiar with the original. It shouldn't be like Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, where they cut so much out of the plot that it doesn't even make sense unless you are familiar with the original book. And for those who do know and love the source material, it's what Robert Stamm called the pleasure in intertextual citation. Knowing winks to what came before. Is A Knight's Tale anything like Chaucer? No! But the winks and nods to elements of the Canterbury Tales, the characters of the Pardoner and the Summoner, for example, add pleasure to those who know the origins. Stamm considered willful infidelity to be the very point of adaptation, taking gaps in and differences from the original source material to interrogate the political and ideological underpinnings of that material and use it to say something about the moment of production. He described a vast web of references and tropes ripe for appropriating, disassembling, and rearranging. Murray talks about the use of other references within an adaptation, the permeability of high pop culture boundaries, overdue acknowledgements of extra literary sources for adaptations such as pulp fiction, comic books, and computer games, and recognition of resistance or opposition audience decodings of the texts in ways possibly unforeseen by the textual producers. The recognition that audiences appreciate adaptations precisely because of the mass of existing pop culture knowledge they bring to them. Basically, audiences bring their whole selves to a text, reading them against the grain, bringing in other sources that they recognise within the text that may have not been there intentionally. And so too does the auteur bring in other references. As Leach says, it may seem commonsensical to assume a one-to-one correspondence between film adaptations and their literary sources, but each individual adaptation invokes many precursor texts beside the one whose title it usually borrows. We can see this in the example that we're using. While this film's title is Wuthering Heights, many have noticed similarities between the trailer and the bodice-ripping romance genre. And with this wedding dress and this film poster, Emerald Fennel is obviously riffing off another famous film adaptation of a book about toxic relationships between horrible people. Gone with the Wind. Film adaptations are not the only intertexts in the room either. As Leach says, an adaptation is assumed to be a window into a text on which it depends for its authority. The business of viewers and analysts is to look through the window for signs of the original text. Every text is an intertext that depends for its interpretation on shared assumptions about language, culture, narrative, and other presentational conventions. Bronte herself is referencing the Gothic and Romantic tradition, as I mentioned earlier, modes and references that would have seemed in her time as retro as shoulder pads and synth and drum machine heavy music production do now. There is no work that is not influenced by stories and styles of the time in which it is written. So if we allow Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte to stand without judgmental reference to the works that she is riffing on, why can we not do the same for Wuthering Heights by Emerald Fennel? If fidelity is not the be-all and end-all of how we should measure the success of an adaptation, if adaptations can take what inspiration they want from a given text, interpolate it with other texts and contexts and vibes, how are we to decide what is a good and what is a bad adaptation? How should we judge these texts? Well, not by the trailer. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. It is different from other times I've talked about adaptation theory. Doing a lot of research has changed my mind on this topic, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Did you like the trailer? Are you going to watch the film? Let's talk about it more there. And if you are new here, my name's Roisin. I put out new videos fairly regularly and video essays as often as I can. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye bye.